What is the difference between Bokmål and nynorsk? That's a question I keep getting a lot from students, and therefore I decided to make this video to hopefully explain that a little bit to you. Now, in order to understand why we have Bokmål and nynorsk in Norway, you need to know that Norway was actually part of Denmark for many centuries, up to 1814. And during that time, the few people that could read or write wrote actually in Danish, because Danish and Norwegian, they are pretty similar. So if you speak Norwegian very well, you will be able to understand Danish also. The pronunciation is quite different, but once you get used to that, you can communicate with people from Denmark, even with Norwegian. So at the time, people would speak, would write in Danish. And when Norway became independent nation in 1814, the big question was, what national language are we going to use? So there were two groups of people. Some people said, okay, we've been writing Danish for centuries. Why not just continue doing that? We will fix a few writing issues that are unnatural for the Norwegian pronunciation, and we will add a few words that are typical of the Norwegian language and that are not common in the Danish language, but apart from that, we're just going to continue. And then there were other people, you know, in the 19th century, national romanticism, they said, no, we're an independent nation now. Okay, we still have this union with Sweden, but somehow we're independent. We want our own language. And there was a linguist, his name was Ivar Aasen. He traveled to the western Norwegian fjords, to small villages, and he listened to people, he listened to their dialects. And out of these dialects, he constructed his own Norwegian language. So in 1848, he published a grammar book, the Norske Folkespråksgrammatikk, and 2 years later, the Norske Folkespråksordbok, so the dictionary of the Norwegian people's language. And some people liked this idea and said, okay, let's go somehow back in history. Let's start using a language that is based on our dialects. And then in 1885, the Norwegian parliament that made the big mistake, it accepted that both these language variations, meaning the Norwegian developed by Ivar Aasen and the somehow Norwegianized Danish, became official languages. And from that moment on, citizens in Norway can use either of the two when they're communicating with authorities. This is still the situation today. So whenever you when you want to do your tax return, you can choose which variation you want to have. When you do an exam at university, you have to register, you have to write your candidate number and the subject and the study field and whatever, and whether you want to do the exam in Bokmål and nynorsk. Okay? At the time, these names still did not exist. At the time, this was called riksmål and landsmål. So riksmål was actually the empirical language. Why this name? Well, good question. That's the old Danish somehow, and landsmål was the new language developed by Ivar Aasen. And in 1929, the names changed, and at that time it was called, or since then, it has been called Bokmål. So Bokmål comes from Danish, and nynorsk comes from the dialects. Bokmål means actually book language, and nynorsk, new Norwegian. It's not really new because, of course, these dialects, they were very, very old, but they had never been used as a written language. In order to make everything even more complicated, once we had this situation with the two different written languages, many Norwegians thought, or some Norwegians thought, okay, they are not so far from each other. They're basically like two dialects. Why not merge them? So then the Norwegian government started to do orthography reforms. So every 10, 20 years, you would have a change in the official writing of both Bokmål and nynorsk with the goal of making them more similar to each other. And this was something that the majority of the population protested against a lot. Why? Because these changes were not just tiny differences like between American and British English, where you think whether color has a U or no. These were big changes. So for example, in Bokmål, a third gender was introduced because Danish has only 2 genders, but most Norwegian dialects have 3. So in Bokmål, suddenly hundreds of words got a different grammatical gender. The spelling was sometimes changed completely. The Ministry of Education started to rewrite textbooks for school, and they even altered century-old texts, national literature. They just changed the spelling. The rhyme was lost, the rhythm was lost. Didn't matter as long as the spelling was up to date. So of course people hated that. People would go to the streets, they would tear apart textbooks. They called this the language war, språkstriden, which was especially fierce in the 1950s and 1960s. One culmination was on the 20th of February 1962, when a newsreader in the Norwegian television lost his job because he refused to read the weather report with the new expression for snow, which was since then snö, but he wanted to use the old version sne, and he insisted on it, and then he got fired. So a very ridiculous situation, because of course the dialects in Norway are not so far from each other, so people would understand each other, but still there was this huge war until in 1981 this policy of merging the 2 Norwegian languages was finally and officially abandoned. So since then, Bokmål and nynorsk are, just like before, the 2 official languages of the country, and you can choose whichever you want to use. Of course, due to these many orthography reforms that had been in the century before, there are many different forms within Bokmål and within nynorsk that are also somehow acceptable. So that creates some chaos. A simple sentence, the woman raised her hand, can be written in 24 different ways in Bokmål alone. Okay, because you can say kvinnen or kvinna, and then you can say heva or hevde or hevet, and you can say honna or honnen, honna, honnen. So if you multiply these versions, you have 24 possibilities of writing a very simple sentence. They're all Bokmål and they're all correct. Okay, I don't want to go too much into the details now. What are the differences between Bokmål and nynorsk? Maybe one time we can make a separate video about that. Anyway, people then ask me, okay, who speaks Bokmål and who speaks nynorsk? And that is a misconception. Just the question is a misconception because nobody speaks it. The thing is that these 2 languages, Bokmål and nynorsk, they are written languages. Norwegians speak their dialects, and the dialects are regional, and they can be a little bit more closer or further from either Bokmål or nynorsk. So in the cities, the pronunciation or the way people speak is usually closer to Bokmål, and in the countryside, especially in the west, it's usually more closer to nynorsk, but that's just a rough idea. So which one to learn? For you as a student, is it a difficult choice? Not at all. It's very simple, although some Norwegians will hate me for what I'm going to say now. The thing is, 90% of Norwegians nowadays use Bokmål. Okay, so the former Danish, somehow Norwegianized language. Therefore, it makes sense absolutely to learn Bokmål, unless you know for sure that you will live in a tiny village somewhere in the west where everybody uses nynorsk. But apart from that, I would just definitely go for Bokmål. Understanding nynorsk is not so difficult. Though I do recommend, if you're an advanced student, like beyond the A2 level, I would say it does not hurt to learn a little bit of nynorsk. In our books and in our online video courses, there's a small chapter about nynorsk. The reason we put it there is, well, there's 2 reasons actually. One reason is you are going to encounter nynorsk from time to time, because all government agencies and also the official Norwegian media, they have to publish some part of their content in nynorsk. So sometimes you will just have a news article, information from your university, something like that. It will just be written in nynorsk. Don't be afraid, the differences are not that big, so it makes sense to learn like the most important differences in writing and maybe the most common words that differ from both of them. But of course, the overlap is huge. So sometimes it takes a little bit of reading until you realize it's actually not Bokmål, it's nynorsk. The second reason for that, why it makes sense to learn a little bit of nynorsk, is that many dialects are closer to nynorsk. So it will help you understand Norwegians who speak a dialect that is, yeah, as I said, a bit closer to nynorsk. Yeah, so that was a little bit of an overview on the differences between Bokmål and nynorsk. Today, fortunately, it's not a big political topic anymore. It used to be. There was this joke of the young Russian communist coming to Norway in the 1920s. They came to a pub and he saw there's a huge debate and people are fighting. And so he asked somebody, what is going on here? Are people preparing for the revolution, just as in Russia? And the guests said, no, we're just arguing about how to spell the word revolution. So that was the situation in Norway for most of the 20th century, but today Norwegians are pretty relaxed about this topic. Yeah, if you have any questions about this, please feel free to write it in the comments. If you have any experiences with Bokmål and nynorsk, let us know also. Otherwise, if you're interested in learning Norwegian with a coherent story instead of boring dialogues, check out our online courses and our books, The Mystery of Niels, that will take you from 0 to Bergenstest in 2 books or 2 online courses. And feel free to get in touch if you have any questions.